Good day, class. This is Ms. Talatore, and at this point, let's go ahead and talk about the different structure, function, and components of the ecosystem. So, if you're going to define what ecosystem is, obviously we're referring to an interacting group of natural elements and the organisms that is staying within a certain environment. Typically, the living things here respond to adapt to the non living conditions of the environment to maintain their steady state condition, which is known as homeostasis. Now, if we are to talk about the difference between the ecosystem structure and processes, we take the following into consideration. First, the ecosystem structure has two major parts. Obviously, we have the abiotic component and the biotic component. Abiotic ones refers to the non-living or the physical chemical environment of an ecosystem, and the biotic ones refers to the living ecological community on the other hand. If we are to talk about the different processes that happens in an ecosystem, we have two basic kinds. The first one is the cycling of chemical elements, and the second one is the flow of energy. So we can technically say that the ecosystem structure and the processes goes hand in hand, that cycling of chemical elements through the biogeochemical cycles happen through this biotic and abiotic components, and that goes the same way for the flow of energy. Energy in an ecosystem cannot flow if there is no biotic or abiotic components that facilitates the flow of energy. The most common example of um, process where or mechanism rather of flow of energy is that of the food chain and food web. Okay, let's now talk about some specific abiotic components of an ecosystem that plays a major role in shaping the different processes that happens in an ecosystem. Starting off with the sunlight. We all know that sunlight, being an abiotic component of an ecosystem, acts as the primary source of energy for nearly all ecosystems here on Earth. And if we try to focus on the effects of sunlight with plants, we could take into consideration the concept of photoperiodism. Photoperiodism is the response of plants to the length of day and night. If we are to categorize the response of plants following photoperiodism and sunlight, we'll be having three categories rather. First is the long day plant, followed by the short day plant and the day neutral plant. So from the terms themselves, obviously it gives away already of what are these plants are. Obviously, when we talk about long day plants, these are plants that are thriving when there is an extended length of sunlight. Typically, they are the plants that begin their flowering process before the summer solstice, and that's around June 12th. Okay? They flower only when the lengthening of the day reaches a critical length. So, some examples of these are the white radish, or in Tagalog, we have labanos, the Rapanus sativus in scientific um, term. We also have the common spinach or the Spinacia oleracea and the carrots, which is also typically known as the Daucus carota. So, what's the nursing relevance of the following examples? Well, obviously, since this is environmental science for the nursing students, let's try to check on the different medical relevance of these long day plants. So let's start off with radish. Well, obviously, radishes or labanos in Tagalog is known to be a long day plant that typically thrives in tropical regions, and that includes, again, the Philippines being a tropical country. So, in medicinal context, labanos or radish, white radish, is actually used to treat urinary stones and is also considered as an expectorant for coughs. Okay? Whereas on the other hand, the common spinach is actually valued for its nutritional importance. Okay, that is because it is known to have a very high iron content that is known to combat anemia. Carrots, on the other hand, we all know it is very rich in antioxidant and at the same time vitamin A for beta carotene that supports eye health. Okay, now let's talk about short day plants. Well, obviously, it's the opposite of the long day plants. These plants begin their flowering process after the summer solstice, and that's around December 21. Some examples of this that can be found here in the Philippines are as follows. We have the Acapulco, or in English, the ringworm bush. It's Sena alata, and the Sambong in Tagalog, which is Blumea campor or Blumea balsamifera, and the ever popular Manzanilla. It's actually chrysanthemum. Okay, so what are the medical relevance of these short day plants? Well, let's start with Acapulco. Okay, Acapulco is actually known in English as the ringworm bush because it's essential in treating fungal skin infections like that of Tinea flava that causes again ringworm. Okay, with Manzanilla, though we commonly heard of chrysanthemum as an ornamental plant, actually, chrysanthemum again is the source of manzanilla and it's used as an anti-inflammatory tea, and at the same time, it also helps gas pain, especially among infants. Okay. Um, let's have with sambong though. We are all familiar that this is also an approved diuretic medicinal plants by the DOH or the Department of Health, and this is known to dissolve kidney stones and also is capable of treating hypertension. Now let's have the day neutral plant. So from the term itself, it's day neutral, meaning it's not what do you call this one? It's not sensitive with the length of sunlight or day. Okay, they thrive regardless of the season. So again, some examples are lagundi or the Vitex negundo. We have ampalaya or the bitter gourd, the Momordica charantia. We also have guava or bayabas in Tagalog, the Pisidum guavaha, and the malunggay, or it's commonly known as the moringa or moringa oleifera. So, when we talk about these day neutral plants and their medicinal value, okay, um, typically the most common or we're most familiar with is that of the lagundi, because lagundi is known to be what, an herb, okay, that is known for its beneficial medicinal value when it comes to treating asthma, cough, and fever. With ampalaya, I believe, especially among nursing students, you're quite familiar already that ampalaya is known to be helpful in managing type 2 diabetes mellitus. Okay, so it allows what, the lowering of blood sugar levels. With bayabas naman, um, it's known to have its distinct antiseptic characteristics. So we usually use it to treat and wash wounds. And for those newly delivered mom, okay, for those who just gave birth, okay, um it's also used as an antiseptic wash, especially for postpartum care. Okay, with malunggay, again with moringa, we all know that it's very rich in um nutrients. That's the reason why it's also called or it belongs to one of those superfoods. So it's used in nursing because this promotes breastfeeding, okay, and boost as well immune system, especially of the um, mothers who are obviously breastfeeding. Okay, so again, these are the different examples of plants categorized as under long day plants, short day plants, and day neutral plants, and their medicinal values and how they are affected by sunlight. Again, obviously, long day plants are those that thrives during the period when the day is longer, and on the other hand, short day plants are those that thrive when the day time is shorter. Day neutral, on the other hand, is not technically sensitive with the length of um, day. Okay? So again, we all know that sunlight affects different organisms, and it's very important because here we get to realize what specific medicinal plants can be thriving on certain period of the month. So if plants are actually affected by sunlight, how about animals? Well, obviously they are also affected by the length of sunlight. Okay? So we'll be having three categories of animals under the influence of sunlight. This dictates their activity. Okay. So we have crepuscular, nocturnal, and diurnal. So when we talk about crepuscular animals, these are animals that are active during twilight hours, at dawn, and dusk. And here in the Philippines, the most common example of animals that are active during this certain time of the day are cattle and swines. Okay? Now, if we are going to check how or what's the relevance of knowing these animals' activity, okay? In cases of nursing student, it's very important that we're quite familiar with, uh, again, examples of animals that are active during this certain time of the day. Because, for example, in cases of cattle and swine, okay, since cattle and swines are very active during certain time of the day, okay, usually like hours before daybreak or the sun yes, sun rises already. Okay, and hours before it sets, these are the very time that this animals like cattle and swine can be very active and has the chance to transmit certain diseases that they may be carrying, especially if they are in direct contact with what, with um human beings. For example, farmers, okay, who handles them. Okay. Usually, if you are to check on your microbiology and parasitology classes, okay, you may be knowing that cattle and swines are actually carriers of brucellosis. Okay, especially when cattle are actually being milked early in the morning or late in the evening, or just the simple act of herding them can also be a potential way to transmit, okay, agents that causes brucellosis. Okay, so again, that's crepuscular. Again, these are animals that are active during twilight hours, dawn, and dusk. On the other hand, if we talk about nocturnal, these are again animals that are active only during night. And the most common examples of these are rats, bats, and mosquitoes. So, what are some species, for example, of rats that we should take note of, especially in the context of nursing? Again, with rats, we have the Ratus norvegicus and Ratus tanizumi. These are certain rat species that are known to be very active during night and acts as vectors of, or not technically vectors though, but causes leptospirosis. Okay, because usually um these rats are very active at night, and that is also the time when they shed, okay, bacterias that causes leptospirosis. um I just forgot the specific bacterial name, okay, but these are the times when these rodents and rats technically sheds the highest amount of bacteria within their urine. So it's very important that we shouldn't be what getting into flood waters, especially during rainy days, okay, here in the Philippines and at night, because that increases your risk of getting leptospirosis, especially if there are open wounds in areas where there could be high contact with the urine coming from these rats. We also have bats, and we are quite familiar that rats are vectors of different viruses. Okay, if we can recall, there is some news as well that has shared COVID-19 could possibly be spread through the help of bats as vectors, because they are good as carriers, especially of viruses. With Anopheles mosquitoes, okay, we are all familiar that Aedes aegypti are the species or specific mosquitoes that are capable of what transmitting um dengue. But Anopheles mosquitoes, on the other hand, are the great carriers or transmitters of what? Malaria, which is still somehow we're still like having some cases of malaria in the Philippines, specifically in Palawan, if I'm not mistaken. But yes, that's another thing to take note of. We all know that mosquitoes are somehow they are mostly diurnal, but those one are actually, I mean, those that are active entire day and night is known as diurnal. So they tend to, thrive regardless of the time and state of the day. And that's another thing that we should look into. But please take note that mosquitoes are not simply carriers of dengue, okay? But they also can cause malaria and even um, other examples of diseases related with mosquitoes. If I'm not mistaken, chikungunya and Zika viruses are also examples of um, diseases that can be caused by these particular mosquitoes. But again, always take note, majority of those mosquitoes that are thriving at night are that of Anopheles, that again are directly related with malaria, whereas the type of mosquitoes that tends to cause dengue is the urinal. So we better protect ourselves from against this particular mosquitoes, because again, um, they are thriving in certain parts or phases of the day. With other animals that are active during the entire day, okay, we have dogs, cats, birds, poultries, and water buffaloes or carabaos. And again, like cattle, carabaos are also another example of an animal that can be or can act as carrier. Example of disease that we may get from carabaos are schistosoma or schistosomiasis. You are most probably going to, dig deeper, okay, when it comes to what schistosomiasis is. Once you've had your microbiology subject. But yes, again, that's another example of disease that you may be getting from water buffaloes. With poultry, obviously, the most common one are those that causes avian flu, bird flus, okay, salmonella, um, with the poultry eggs, okay, and that goes the same with birds. cats and dogs will obviously they are very great reservoirs of parasites. Parasites regard, I mean, be it bacterial and helmintic. When we say helmintic, well, that involves worms, a roundworm, flatworm, hookworms, and others. They are also great reservoirs of that. And that's the reason why, not to mention, they also carry rabies with them. So, and we all know that Philippines is one of the country known for the high prevalence of rabies, though majority of it is accounted for those caused by dogs. Again, cats can still carry rabies. Rats, they do not have any rabies, but they do cause leptospirosis again through their urine. So always take note of that as well. Okay? So again, those are some examples of different animals that are affected or are active, okay, during certain time of the day. And again, that's related with sunlight. Now, let's have water. Obviously, water is the universal solvent, and without it, well, technically, Earth will not be able to harness life. It's the basis of all life on our planet. And before we proceed with the different effects of water or influences of water in the habitat and ecosystems of different plants, let's talk about it as an agent of weathering. So, when we talk about weathering, this can be a chemical or mechanical way of breaking down rocks that later on produces what? Soil. So without water, there are still some agents of weathering, obviously, but water plays a major role in how rocks are weathered. Okay, now let's hop into how water affects the different um, plants that we have here on Earth. Well, obviously, we have five groups of plants that are what do you call this one, directly related with their water requirements. Okay, so we have the hydrophytes, the mesophytes, the epiphytes, the xerophytes, and the halophytes. So when we talk about hydrophytes, these are from the term itself, hydro, water loving plants. These are plants that lives in water, so their main substrate is actually water. They do not require soil. Example of this is kangkong in Tagalog, which is, I'm sorry, I think I forgot its English term, but yes, but we could. I mean, you're always allowed to check the internet to see what's the English term for kangkong, especially for those who are not Filipino. Okay, I'm so sorry, but the scientific name of kangkong is Ipomoea aquatica, and this is actually an iron rich um hydrophyte that is known actually to help deficiency in anemia, or I'm sorry, iron deficiency rather, that leads to anemia. Okay, this also is or acts as a mild laxative, especially for those who are suffering from mild constipation. So you can consume kangkong as an alternative. But again, I'm not a medical doctor. Always, you of all the people, you should be the one who really knows this one well. Do not take anything unless that's prescribed by your doctor. With mesophytes, well, these are moderate water-loving plants, so meaning they do not require high amount of water for them to survive, and mostly they are planted already in on soil. Okay, so their substrate is soil, but they require water, moderate amount of water. So one example of medicinal plant that is mesophyte is lagundi, and again, everyone is quite familiar with lagundi already. Actually, another example of hydrophytes that has medicinal value is the lotus or the Nelumbo nucifera. The seeds and rhizomes of lotus is actually used for diarrhea, and it also has this um what do you call this one, blood clotting tendency. So it is able to help stop minor bleeding. Okay, for open wounds. Let's have another example of mesopite. Is actually that of the sambong. Okay, this again, I think I mentioned this one already a while ago. We all know that again, sambong helps to dissolve kidney stones, and at the same time, sambong is also known to help hypertensive patients reduce their edema or the swelling. Okay, they experience especially or mostly within their limbs. With epipites from this one though is actually an example of plant that do not require direct water source. Instead, they get its water from the air or the moisture. The example of this one is actually dap-dap. That's a Tagalog term. All the Tagalog names in this particular presentation is actually within this, what do you call this one? I forgot. Uh no, it's not. Obviously, it's not parenthesis, but this quotation marks in there. Okay? So again, for the sake of those foreign students who cannot comprehend Tagalog, the names or the local names of plants and animals I'm including in this presentation are actually enclosed in these quotation marks. Okay? So with dap, this is an example of an epiphyte. It's Erythrina variegata. This is an example of an epiphyte. Typically, what we use here is the bark and the leaves. They are actually known to treat insomnia. They are also helpful when it comes to managing joint pain and rheumatism. We also have another example of epiphyte that has this medicinal value here in the Philippines, and it's called the wag or the Caparis micracantha. Specifically, what we use here are the wood and the leaves. These the wag are actually helpful in managing asthma and certain types of skin conditions. So with zero bites from the prefix zero, you can take note of that. These are plants that love dry conditions. So meaning they do not require very high amount of water. Instead, they thrive in areas that are very dry, like for example, deserts. So the most common example of zero bites are the prickly pear or cactus. In Tagalog, we have this certain example of cactus known as dilang baka. So um, prickly pear is actually or has this folkloric nursing value, which is used commonly as poultice. And this particular poultice is used to reduce localized inflammations. Sometimes it's also being used to treat mumps or in Tagalog, beke. Okay. Another thing aside from cactus is the aloe vera. We are quite, I believe every one of us is quite familiar with aloe vera. So aloe vera is known to have this wound healing, and it's very great in treating minor burns because you know the gel uh part of aloe vera helps in providing I'm sorry, providing soothing effect, especially um in among minor burns. These also helps in accelerating tissue repair. Okay, now let's have halophytes. With halophytes, from the term itself, okay, halophytes are actually those that are salt water loving. So we can say that these are plants that thrives in salt water or in the ocean. Okay, so an example of this one is the mangrove or bakawan or the Rhizophora mucronata. Okay, and again, they are the type of plants that thrive in salty water. So, ma'am, what are the different examples or what are the benefits of halophytes? Like, for example, mangrove. This mangrove's bark is actually known to have very strong astringent properties that it's being used, okay, as an antiseptic wash to treat wounds. It could also be very helpful in treating chronic diarrhea and at the same time dysentery. Dysentery is actually like diarrhea, but diarrhea is mainly caused or mostly caused by viruses. Dysentery, on the other hand, is mainly caused by um, bacteria and parasites. And dysentery actually causes bloody stool and diarrhea already. Okay. Sometimes it also includes mucus. Okay? With nilad or scaviola, this is another example of halopite. This one though is used to treat stomach pains, and the juice from the fruit of it is actually used to treat certain eye irritations. Now, that's all for our um, water as an abiotic component of an ecosystem and its effect among different plants. Let's have the next one, which is temperature. Well, obviously, temperature, we can say that it's quite similar or related with what? Related with sunlight. So, temperature, if we are to define it, is the measure of hotness or coldness of the body, substance, or the environment. Before we talk about the difference between poikilotherms and homeotherms, let's further check the following about temperature. First off is that the air depends, or the temperature of the air rather, depends directly on the surface below. That means that the temperature of the air is directly um, related, okay, with the surface below. For example, let's have like a body of water. If that body of water, let's be specific. If the body of water, let's say ocean, okay, certain part of an ocean in a certain region or area is hot. Therefore, we can say that the temperature of the air above it is hot. And if it's cold below, then obviously the air above it will be cold too. Temperature decreases as you move away from the surface. So we can say as well that temperature and altitude is also what? Related to each other. In what way? Inversely. Okay? The higher you get, okay, or the as the altitude increases, the temperature decreases. Okay? Or as the height increases, the temperature decreases. That's the reason why if you're going to analyze it, summit and like the top of mountains commonly are areas where temperature drops. Okay, weather is significantly influenced by temperature. I do not think I need to further elaborate this one. Well, obviously, temperature plays a role in our weather system. Environmental temperature affects organisms' metabolism. That is correct. Okay, if the temperature is too high, that means it's too hot. Tendency is our metabolism will be fast. If it's too low, that means the environment is cold, then our metabolism will be slow. So let's talk about the different temperature regulations in animals. So we have two um, we have two categories of animals related to this one. I'm sorry if you're hearing the background noise of dogs barking. Okay. So if we talk about poikilotherms, these are actually animals that are known to be cold-blooded. So therefore, their internal temperature actually varies with that of the ambient environmental temperature. Okay. On the other hand, homeotherms are those that are warm-blooded, so they're capable of maintaining thermal homeostasis regardless of the ambient temperature. That means their body temperature is not directly affected or related with what? With the environment. Okay? Examples of poikilotherms or cold blooded animals are reptiles, amphibians, and fishes. So that means if their environment is hot, okay, tendency is they'll feel the same. Okay. Whereas examples of homeotherms or warm-blooded animals or mammals and birds, and that includes us, human beings being mammals, okay, we tend or we are capable of what? Regulating our own body temperature. That also explains why if you're going to notice, if you happen to visit a zoo, you'll notice that there are some instances where reptiles tends to open their mouth and stuff. That's actually one way of them to regulate their body temperature since they do not sweat like how mammals and other warm-blooded animals do. Okay? Though birds, I'm not quite sure. I think birds do not sweat as well though. But they do have their own way of regulating their temperature. Okay? So, let's have some, nursing relevance related with poikilotherms and homeotherms. So, what are some key things to take note of if we are to talk about poikilotherms and homeotherms? Obviously, for example, with poikilotherms, we have reptiles and amphibians, and when we talk about them here in the Philippines, it's known that we have lots of different reptiles and amphibians, right? We're very big in biodiversity. So, if we are to follow traditional Philippine medicine, python, reticulated python, is actually known to be very beneficial when it comes to treating burns and skin infections, specifically its bile and fat, if it's used topically. Another thing is the Philippine cobra, okay? The Naha philippinensis. Okay, obviously, if for us to have or to create anti-venom, we should be getting it from them. Okay. Another thing, though this one is like, in the field of folkloric medicine or traditional medicine too. If you're quite familiar with toke gecko or tuko in Tagalog, that is known to treat asthma. Again, following folkloric medicine, okay? Take note of that. And tuberculosis, okay? But again, always take note or always verify sources, especially when we talk about different medicinal values or benefits coming from regardless both animals or plants. Okay. With homeotherms though, the most common example is like carabaos or water buffalo. So, ma'am, what's with carabaos? Typically, carabao milk is used as a very vital source of nutritional what? Um, Milk, especially for those children who are very malnourished and are having iron deficiency, leading to anemia. So, Carabao's milk is commonly used to manage that one because of its nutrient deficiency. Chicken broth is another example. Well, obviously, you cannot have chicken broth if you do not have chicken. So, native chicken is another example of homeotherms. And we all know that chicken essence or broth is typically a standard nursing recommendation, especially for what? For convalescent care. Okay? To aid in the faster recovery of patients, especially those that suffers from lost appetite. Okay, so obviously those are some examples of poikilotherms and homeotherms that has different medical or medicinal value. Now, let's talk about wind. So again, we're done with sunlight, with water, with temperature. Let's now have wind. So obviously wind is same with air. The only difference is that wind is moving air, and because of its motion, it causes differences in air pressure within our atmosphere. Always remember that, again, I think this goes the same for chemistry in general and even biology, that things tend to go from high area concentration to low area concentration. And that includes what? Pressure. Air under high pressure tends to move towards the areas of low pressure. And that's the time when we develop LPAs, leading to different tropical, I mean, later on, producing tropical cyclones like here in the Philippines. Okay? The greater the pressure difference is, the faster the air flows. And wind is also another example of what? Agent of weathering. Wind causes erosion that leads to soil formation. Another thing to take note of is that aside from wind being an agent of weathering, it's also an agent of pollination. Okay, so it's able to disperse pollen and seeds, and it disperses nutrients as well, especially those within the topsoil. Okay, and if the wind is very, very strong, it can transport nutrients from places. For example, like places that of mountain summits or peaks. Okay, so if wind is very strong still, that is those areas can still be able to transport, okay, nutrients from one place to another. Another thing to take note of is that wind helps increase water loss through evaporation among organisms during hot summer days. And obviously, this also affects plants' growth. Now, if we are to further talk about wind, we need to talk about monsoons. And when we talk about monsoons, which are again large scale seasonal wind, here in the Philippines we experience two. We have the southwest monsoon and the northeast monsoon. In Tagalog, southwest monsoon is known as Habagat and northeast monsoon is called as Amihan. They are technically the same thing. They just are experienced in the Philippines in different months. So the monsoon or seasonal wind we're getting from June to October that brings in abundant rainfall and extensive cloud development affecting the western region of our country is that of the Habagat or the southwest monsoon. On the other hand, the ones we're experiencing every November to February, that again brings the same thing, but this time in the eastern portion of the country, that's Amihan. Okay? And moving further, okay, we won't be um our topic about wind will not be complete if we are not to talk about the atmosphere. Okay? But nothing to worry, I'm not going to talk about all the layers of the atmosphere. You should know it and are quite familiar about of it already at this time. Let me just go ahead and just have a very quick recall of the different atmospheric gases. This order is based on the amount they cover in the atmosphere. So we have nitrogen, oxygen, water vapor, methane, ozone, and at the same time the other traced gases. Okay, so if you're going to notice nitrogen, this technically is what part it plays a major role in the composition of different biomolecules. If you're going to further recall your biochemistry class, nitrogen is one of the greatest composition of your DNA, okay, and RNA. So nitrogen supplies the much needed nutrition for plant growth. We also have nitrogen fixing bacteria that rely on nitrogen, and nitrogen in the atmosphere is actually fixed. Okay, if we're going to talk about nitrogen cycle in a short while, but yes, part of it is actually nitrogen fixation, which happens whenever lightning strikes. And how does nitrogen fixed through um, lightning? gets into our system or enters the food chain or gets into the soil. That is through precipitation or rain. Oxygen, I think I do not need to further emphasize this one. Well, obviously, it's very important for the processes of photosynthesis among photosynthetic plants and animals, organisms, okay? And respiration. Without oxygen, in just few minutes, will die. Water vapor. This is highest near the equator since, again, the equatorial area is the tropic region where the concentration of sunlight is very high. Tropical rainforest is also rich in water vapor because of high humidity. So water vapor is the reason, water vapor in the atmosphere is the reason why heat is being redistributed in the atmosphere. Ma'am, in what form is heat redistributed? Through latent heat energy transfer within the atmosphere. Water vapor also plays a major role in condensation that later on leads to rain or precipitation. And water vapor helps warm Earth through the process of greenhouse effect. Methane, again, we are quite familiar with that one already. Ozone is the what do you call this one? Ozone is the layer of the atmosphere that is capable of protecting us from the violent rays of the sun. We all know that. Methane, it's highly flammable and it's a byproduct of biological processes. And this acts as a main source of energy too. Um, like LPGs and others, well, obviously, we make use of methane there. Now, question. Though I think I've had it shared already during our actual face-to-face class, no? But if oxygen is very important for us, why is our atmosphere highly or mostly occupied by nitrogen? Again, that is because, I mean, knowing that nitrogen cannot be consumed right away and has to be fixed first before we can use it, then how come majority of the atmosphere is made up of nitrogen? That is, nitrogen helps in diluting oxygen. It has to be more than the oxygen content in our atmosphere because oxygen is very flammable. Without nitrogen diluting our atmosphere, technically, what will happen is all oxygen touches, and that means everything around us, including us, will be set on fire. Literally. Okay? And that's also the reason why, if you're going to recall during your fire drill, what's the most common advice by this fire drill instructors? That is us not to put water on fire, but instead, what? Put blanket on top of a burning stuff, especially if it's something that can be covered, to cut out oxygen source because that's what's feeding fire. Okay? Because again, oxygen is highly flammable. Let's now go or proceed to the next example of abiotic component of an ecosystem that also plays a major role, and that's none other than rocks and soil. Well, obviously, soil cannot be formed without rocks, and rocks are actually made up of what? Different minerals. That's the basic unit of rock. So the material interface between the atmosphere, the lithosphere, and the hydrosphere, that's technically made up of rocks and soil. And this portion or abiotic component sustains the growth of plants and animals because what? It acts as the substrate of plants. And without plants, there won't be animals. Okay? And like what I mentioned a while ago, rocks and soil is actually built of what? Minerals and organic material. These rocks and soil is formed from physical, chemical, and biotic forces that acts on organic and weathered rock to form them. So if we are to characterize soil, usually we check their organic content, their pH, and their texture. Their texture, on the other hand, is determined by the minerals, the water, and the air that is present within the soil. Now, we'll be talking about three examples. We have clay, silt, and sandy. And if you're going to notice, okay, clay is the smallest what? The smallest um type of soil particle running at less than 0.002 millimeters, then followed by silt, which is around 0.002 to 0.05 millimeters, and the sandy being the largest among the three at 0.05 to 2 millimeters. Okay? So if you're going to notice with clay, it's still like made up of the others like sand and silt, but obviously you can expect that clay is mainly made up of clay itself. Okay, it's sticky when wet and holds water and nutrients well. With silt, it goes the same with clay and sandy. Actually, these types of soil are actually a combination of the three. It's just that majority of it is made up of, the main type. With silt, it's smooth and slippery when wet. And with sandy, since it's like the largest particle among the three, it drains quickly after rain, but it's easy to work with. It warms up quickly when in warm weather and has the lower moisture and nutrient capacity because, again, of its large structure. So, if we are to check, or if we are planning to like plant certain plants, okay, you could try to look into the following, and obviously, clay will be the best option among the three if the plant requires higher water concentration. Okay, but if a plant requires less water, then you may go for sandy. Now, let's proceed to the last abiotic components that directly affects an ecosystem, and that involves chemical substances, both that organic and inorganic. So if we are focusing with the inorganic substances, well, obviously, we have acids, bases, and salts. We also have water and carbon dioxide, and the biomolecules, which are the carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and nucleic acid. Okay? Obviously, without these carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and nucleic acid, or the biomolecules, we won't be living. Okay? That's the reason why they're called biomolecules, because they play a major role in our lives. Without proteins, without lipids, and nucleic acid, we are going to cease to exist. Okay? Now let's talk about the periodic disturbances, and that includes catastrophic ones. So, the thing with periodic disturbances is that they can affect an ecosystem by directly devastating biological communities. Okay? After certain periodic disturbances, an area is recolonized by organisms, and the structure of the community undergoes a succession of changes during the rebound. That explains why certain areas that we used to know can change into another type of area, or in this case, let's say biomes. For example, there are some areas which used to be, let's say for example, covered with greens and like had forest, but eventually after millions of years it has been converted into a desert one. And typically that succession can be triggered by certain periodic disturbances. Now, with periodic disturbances, we can also have what we call as catastrophic disturbances. And this is related with catastrophes. Like, for example, the natural calamities like hurricanes, tornadoes, volcanic eruptions, flooding can be another example of this one. Fire, like surface fire, ground fire, and ground fire. Well, all of those are examples of catastrophic disturbances that can alter what? Biological communities and an ecosystem. A very solid example of this one is what? the volcanic eruptions. The nearest one that and the latest one that we've had is that of the Taal volcano eruption, right? And that has affected the direct community residing within the Taal area. Okay? So those are the different abiotic components of an ecosystem and their relevance to the nursing field. I hope you learned something new today. This is Miss Del Torre and I'll see you in the next lesson po. Goodbye everyone. Thank you.